Why does Israel exist?
Partition of Palestine.
Jewish immigration adding steadily to the European element in the country.
And why is it so unconditionally supported by the West?
Here's a red line, but I'm never going to leave Israel.
The answer isn't as obvious as you might think.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel.
And definitely not what you've been told for decades. What if I told you that a forgotten Palestinian uprising in the 1930s,
unrest in Palestine, had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government?
against the British might hold the answer, and can explain why Joe Biden today is willing to risk his presidential re-election.
Biden is navigating some complicated political cross-currents when it comes to his unwavering support for Israel.
To support a state that is committing unspeakable horrors. This is not a tale of morality, but of geopolitical chess. It will shed light on the past and help inform where we're heading in the future. But first, let's go back in time to the 1890s. This man, Theodor Herzl, put forward an ideology of political Zionism that promoted Jewish self-determination. His vision, European Jews would settle Palestine. This emerged against the backdrop of centuries of European Christian anti-Semitism and the rise of nationalism around the world. Zionist leaders understood that to fulfill their aspiration of a Jewish state, they needed a great imperialist power as a benefactor. And from their earliest writings, Zionists made clear that they would also need to remove the native population that lived there, the Palestinians. See, at the turn of the 20th century, the world looked very different than it does today, and little did the Zionists know the dominant powers would be a challenge to convince. As Palestine was under Ottoman rule at the time, Zionist leaders saw the Sultan as a critical actor. In 1896, they saw an opportunity to engage. With mounting financial debt, they offered the Sultan 20 million British pounds, the equivalent of $2.2 billion today, for a charter to colonize Palestine. Even though the sum would have alleviated 20% of Ottoman debt, the Sultan said, hell no. Zionist leaders tried Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. He said no. They tried Tsarist Russia. They said no. They also went to France, and they also said no. With no success, the Zionist movement started to consider alternatives for Palestine, like Cyprus, Argentina, Mozambique, and the Sinai Peninsula. See, you can't separate the inception of Zionism from the European context it emerged from. Like other white Europeans, they felt an entitlement over the world because it was like a box of chocolates. They can just pick any random country to colonize. Nothing captures this more than the surreal and farcical Uganda scheme. In 1903, Zionist leaders finally were able to convince the British of the importance of a Jewish state, and so the British offered them their colony in Uganda. This wasn't done altruistically. Fueled by their own anti-Semitism, the British didn't want Jewish refugees escaping pogroms, institutional racism, and violence driven by white Christian European anti-Semitism to come to the UK. So they thought, let's just send them to Africa. Sound familiar? The Uganda scheme ultimately failed because the British colonists already there didn't want other colonists to come and take their place. It was like a game of colonial monopoly. But World War I changed everything. The Ottoman Empire fell, and with it 600 years of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and other minorities living mostly harmoniously together across the region. European powers proceeded to carve up the Middle East, and the British took over Palestine. In 1917 came the most pivotal moment for the Zionist movement. British Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour gave British Zionists the imperialist patron they desperately needed. Through the stroke of his pen, he authored a one-page document that changed the course of history forever by promising the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. Was it his to give? Absolutely not, but his motivations weren't entirely altruistic. The British needed to create a buffer east of Egypt as a way to maintain control and protect the Suez Canal, an essential financial, trading, and transportation artery for the empire that connected them to India and other colonies in the east. Control over Palestine would also ensure a contiguous land route from the Gulf to the Mediterranean to exert influence and control over a region they now oversaw. And finally, establishing a Jewish homeland was an answer to the Jewish problem in Europe, because sending Jews to Palestine was better than having them come to the UK. British imperialist and Zionist objectives were one and the same: a Eurocentric, culturally aligned colonial entity in Palestine. Palestinians were not even acknowledged in the Balfour Declaration. They were referred to as non-Jewish inhabitants, seen only as what they were not. The British gave the Zionist movement special status under their mandate, allowing a Zionist shadow government, facilitating the flow of mass Jewish immigration and capital, and allowing the expropriation of Palestinian land. In every way, the Zionist project was an extension of British imperialism. This introduced transformative changes.
For the last few decades, Jewish immigration has been adding steadily to the European element in the country. Israelites are returning from practically every country in Europe, from England, from France and Belgium, from Germany, Poland and Russia. But first, they exist as best they can under canvas. But then they begin to build their own houses. And one after the other, the new buildings rise till they form big colonies together.
From 1918 to 1926, the Jewish population tripled from 6% to 18%, and then to 30% by 1939. With it came hundreds of millions of dollars worth of capital and assets that were invested in Palestine and changed it from an agrarian society to an industrial economy. But that economy wasn't for everyone. Zionism pushed the concept of Jewish-only labor and intentionally excluded Palestinians. On top of that, the expropriation of Palestinian land by the Jewish Agency, with the blessing of the British, drove Palestinian peasants off their farms and into poverty and unemployment. 1/3 of Palestinian agricultural land was taken, and 20,000 families were evicted. These political, social, and economic upheavals, overseen by British colonialism, produced one of the greatest revolts against the British in history. Revisionist Zionist leader Jabotinsky wrote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and what they will persist in doing as long as there remains a solitary spark of hope that they will be able to prevent the transformation of Palestine into the land of Israel." See, resistance to British colonialism started from the onset. Palestinians and Arabs rose up again and again through demonstrations, strikes, riots, and armed resistance, most famously through the leadership of religious scholar Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, who organized and mobilized the country's peasant class to pick up arms to fight the British and Zionists in Palestine, and even the French in Syria. If the name Qassam sounds familiar, he's the inspiration behind the name of Hamas's military wing.
In case of the Arabs is against the British government's policy in Palestine, a policy which, if continued, will surely have as a result the replacement of the Arabs by the Jews. The Arabs who decided on a general and a complete strike.
Tensions in Palestine came to head in 1936, when the Palestinian elite leadership called for a strike and the country responded. Armed groups in the countryside also engaged in spontaneous guerrilla warfare against Zionist and British targets. It is during this time the kufiya became a symbol of Palestinian resistance to colonialism. Originally a headdress worn by Palestinian farmers toiling the land, now it was used to conceal the identity of Palestinian resistance fighters from the authorities. The period also gave us many of Palestine's iconic folk songs that are imbued with the spirit of defiance and resistance. The strike ended after 6 months through promises of political concessions, pressure from Arab regimes who sought favor from the British, and the threat of martial law. A British commission looking into the revolt proposed the partition of Palestine into an Arab and Jewish state as a solution, failing to address colonialism as the root cause of what was happening in the country. After that, not much changed, and the second phase of the revolt began, this time led by peasants who engaged in full armed resistance. With mass popular support, they were able to liberate and govern different parts of Palestine, including the old city of Jerusalem.
But Jerusalem itself has troubles too. Riots are reported daily from various parts of the city.
The British responded with crushing force, bringing in special reinforcements from their colonial empire, including Ireland and India. They mobilized their air force and launched a counter-insurgency campaign across the entire country. The British also enlisted, trained, and armed Zionist militias to fight alongside them in crushing the Palestinian uprising. It took the British and the Zionists 2 years to gain control from the Palestinian resistance after fierce fighting. By 1939, 5,000 Palestinians were killed, 14,000 were injured, and many more imprisoned or forced into exile, including the Palestinian leadership. The most staggering number is that 10% of the adult male population was killed. These events are fundamental to understanding why Israel exists. The destruction of Palestinian society, its economy, its leadership, and its resistance from 1918 to 1947 by the British on behalf of the Zionist movement laid the foundation for the Israeli state and left Palestinians unable to fully stand up against the Zionist militias who perpetrated the Nakba. Meanwhile, in Europe, a genocide against Jews was taking place, leading to a huge increase in Jewish immigration and settlement in Palestine.
It is the tragedy that even here the wandering Jew can find no rest. For once peaceful Palestine is today a land of terror and bloodshed. From the virgin desert, under the protection of Britain, The Jew has built himself a modern home. Will he be allowed to keep it?
The new post-World War II order, led by the West, moved to create the State of Israel, and in 1948 voted to partition Palestine at the UN. Palestinians opposed partition and voted no, but as history has shown us time and time again, Palestinians were of no consequence to these great powers, and 52 years later, Herzl's dream of colonizing Palestine came true. As the British Empire was decomposing, a new liberal world order was taking shape, and Zionists recognized the need for a new imperialist patron.
We set up the Israeli government in Palestine, moved some of the Arabs out.
As a settler colony, Israel needed a metropole, and unlike other settler colonies, for Israel it wasn't one country, but the entirety of the West led by the United States. The same way the Zionist movement was an extension of British imperialism in Palestine, Israel now served at the forefront of Western imperialism in the Middle East. It was part and parcel of the establishment and the New World Order, U.S. unipolarity and Western hegemony.
5,000 times in my career, the Ironclad Commitment of the United States has to Israel, based on our principles, our ideas, our values. They're the same values.
Against the backdrop of the Cold War, oil extraction, and financial interests in the region, Israel served as an outpost of the US and the West to safeguard these interests. That is why Biden said this:
The best $3 billion investment we make, were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
Israel is vital to their interests. At the same time, Israel and Jewish American communities built powerful lobbying, financial, and organizational power in the US that impacted and influenced US politics and foreign policy for decades. This special relationship has led to unconditional support from the US and the West, regardless of which party is in power. Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of US foreign aid. Despite projections of power, Israel wouldn't survive without the US.
Tonight, the US military is now rushing military supplies and air defenses to Israel.
And it couldn't have carried out its genocide in Gaza without their support. When you analyze why Israel exists from the lens of colonization, imperial power, and Western hegemony, you fully understand why there's no accountability for its actions, and why Biden is willing to lose an election to Trump to maintain support for this project, because it transcends presidents.
Father pointed out to me, I did not need to be a Jew to be a Zionist, for I am.
It is deeply rooted institutional ideology. As the world changes, Western hegemony declines, and people around the world awaken. We are at the precipice of history where a new world order is being defined. The historic war in Palestine that started over 100 years ago is a reflection of the state of the world. The decolonization of Palestine comes hand in hand with a world order that is more just and equitable, and where the US and the West do not dominate. But what that looks like is not given. It requires the political participation of billions of people around the world to shape it, and avoid the mistakes of the last century. My name is Salim, and I tell stories that connect the unexpected. Subscribe for more. And to support our work, sign up to our Patreon.